it's just begun. When you're feeling real low, yeah, there's a great truth that you should know. When you're young, gifted, and bright.
Good evening and welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for taking time away from your busy schedules. Join us tonight for From Linguistic Racism. Linguistic Racism to Linguistic Justice and Liberation, Black Language, Literacy, and Learning. I am Aisha White, Director of the PRIDE Program in the Office of Child Development. PRIDE is an acronym for Positive Racial Identity Development in Early Education. We work to build the positive racial identity of Black children aged 3 to 8 by helping the important adults in their lives gain skills, knowledge, and resources to support them. We also work to raise awareness more broadly about the ways race and racism impact all children. Part of the reason I'm here with our esteemed guests tonight is because in 2018 and 2019, the PRIDE team spent about a year learning about and discussing African American vernacular English. And then we shared our learning with the broader Office of Child Development through a series of trainings. Before I introduce our two other guests, a few acknowledgements. This program is hosted by the PRIDE Program and the Pitt Ed Justice Collective. We would also like to thank the funders of the PRIDE Program, the W.K. Kellogg Foundation and the Henry L. Hillman Foundation. We'd also like to thank the Pittsburgh Study, a community partnered initiative designed to help children thrive from pregnancy through high school. Tonight is co-sponsored by the kindergarten through third grade team of the Pittsburgh Study, who is working to improve literacy skills by focusing on 3 R's: reading, racial equity, and relationships. More thanks. I'd like to thank our ASL, American Sign Language interpreters. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't thank the person who made all of this possible. And that's my colleague, Medina Jackson, who's the Director of Engagement for the PRIDE Program. This was her brainchild, and we are so pleased to see everything come together tonight. And now our other guests. Dr. April Baker Bell is Associate Professor of Language, Literacy, and English Education in the Department of English and Department of African American and African Studies at Michigan State University. Her book, Linguistic Justice, Black Language, Literacy, Identity, and Pedagogy, has been described as ushering in a new program and thought system for Black language and liberation for the 21st century. It brilliantly reminds us of the ways the struggles for and triumphs of Black freedom have always been expressed within the deeply embedded philosophies of Black language. Welcome, Dr. Baker Bell. Dean Valerie Kinloch is the Renee and Richard Goldman Dean of the School of Education at the University of Pittsburgh. I can best describe Dean Kinloch as both a trailblazer and a force of nature. No one who is in her presence for long has any question about the importance of equity and social justice to quality education. She has authored and edited 4 books, including Race, Justice, and Activism in Literacy Instruction, Urban Literacies, Critical Perspectives on Language, Learning, and Community, Crossing Boundaries, Teaching and Learning with Urban Youth, and Harlem on Our Minds, Place, Race, and Literacies of Urban Youth. Welcome, Dean Kinloch. And while I have you, would you like to say a few words about the Pitt Ed Justice Collective?
Oh, sure. Thank you for that, Dr. White. The Pitt Ed Justice Collective was formed in the School of Education at the University of Pittsburgh on June 1st, 2020. And it's been something that I've been thinking about for a number of years. I decided to form it on June 1st as a response to all of the racist incidents and racisms happening in this world, particularly on the heels of Mr. George Floyd's murder. and having people invited into conversations about equity, justice, and love. And that's the Pitt Ed Justice Collective. We focus on teaching, learning, engagement, and being in community with each other to think about these things deeply. And so if you would like more information about the Pitt Ed Justice Collective, visit the School of Education's webpage, and you can actually register to receive updates regularly. So thank you, Dr. White.
No, you're welcome. A bit of housekeeping. Today's meeting is being recorded and is being live streamed. All attendees who are on Zoom with us are muted and cannot display video. And if you want to ask a question of the panelists, please type your question into either the Q&A button on Zoom or the comment section on YouTube. We will do our best to answer as many questions as possible. Our format for tonight is we'll start off with a short video to get things started. We'll spend a little time answering some of the questions that the Pride team put together, and then we'll leave time at the end to respond to audience questions. You will want to stick around though, because at the end of the program, we have not one, but 4 door prizes to give away, 3 books and a video. And at the end of the program, our technical folks will post information up with a link to a list of resources that we probably will refer to at some point during our conversation, including some of the books that I just described. And please, on September 8th, take a listen to the latest Pride podcast series on bias. The final episode focuses on language bias. So that's the Pride team In My Skin podcast. You can find it on the Pride website. So let's begin by taking a look at Jamila Lyscott's TED Talk, 3 Ways to Speak English.
Observe the show where my soul dwells and announced that I'm articulate, which means that when it comes to enunciation and diction, I don't even think of it because I'm articulate. So when my professor asks a question and my answer is tainted with the connotation of urbanized suggestion, there's no misdirected intention. Pay attention because I'm articulate. So when my father asks, what kind of thing is this? My articulate answer never goes amiss. I say, Father, this is the impending problem at hand. And when I'm on the block, I switch it up just because I can. So when my boy says, what's good with you, son? I say, I just fall out with them people, but I done. And sometimes in class, I might pause the intellectual sound and flow to ask, yo, why these books never be about my peoples? Yes, I have decided to treat all 3 of my languages as equal because I'm articulate. But who controls articulation? Because the English language is a multifaceted oration subject to indefinite transformation. Now you may think that it is ignorant to speak broken English, but I'm here to tell you that even articulate Americans sound foolish to the British. So when my professor comes on the block and says hello, I stop him and say, no, you're being inarticulate. The proper way is to say what's good. Now, you may think that's too hood. That's not cool. But I'm here to tell you that even our language has rules. So when mommy mocks me and says, y'all be mad going to the store, I say, mommy, no, that sentence is not following the law. Never does the word mad go before a present participle. That's simply the principle of this English. If I had the vocal capacity, I would sing this from every mountaintop, every suburbia, and every hood, because the only God of language is the one recorded in the Genesis of this world, saying it is good, so I may not always come before you with excellency of speech, but do not judge me by my language and assume that I'm too ignorant to teach, because I speak 3 tongues, 1 for each, home, school, and friends. I'm a trilingual orator. Sometimes I'm consistent with my language now and switch it up so I don't bore later. Sometimes I fight back 2 tongues while I use the other one in the classroom. And when I mistakenly mix them up, I feel crazy like I'm cooking in the bathroom. I know that I had to borrow your language because mine was stolen. You can't expect me to speak your history wholly while mine is broken. These words are spoken by someone who is simply fed up with the Eurocentric ideals of this season. And the reason I speak a composite version of your language is because mine was raped away along with my history. I speak broken English so the profusing gashes can remind us that our current state is not a mystery. I'm so tired of the negative images that are driving my people mad. So unless you've seen it rob a bank, stop calling my hair bad. I'm so sick of this nonsensical racial disparity. So don't call it good unless your hair is known for donating to charity as much as has been raped away from our people. How can you expect me to treat their imprint on your language as anything less than equal? Let there be no confusion. Let there be no hesitation. This is not a promotion of ignorance. This is a linguistic celebration. That's why I put trilingual on my last job application. I can help to diversify your consumer market is all I wanted them to know. When they call me for the interview, I'll be more than happy to show it. I can say, what's good, what's agwan, and of course, hello. Because I'm articulate. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. So of course, I love, love, love that video. We watched it as a team and had a conversation about it. And while all of it is pretty powerful, the thing that struck me the most was the line where she says, unless you've seen it robbing a bank, don't call my hair bad. Don't call it good unless your hair is known for donating to charity. Aside from that, I think what she's doing is that statement is illustrating the absurdity of calling hair good or bad, but it's also doing a lot of playing with language. Did either of you want to respond to the video, Dr. Baker Bell or Dr. Kinlock?
I mean, I think that the one thing when I use the video, I love that part, you know, the line that you just pointed out, but I think that she does a lot with history, you know, and I often think that like the historical context when we're talking about Black language is often missing. You know, that's not what children typically get in their language education. So I love how she connects it to history, but I also like how she talks about how American English is, you know, laughed at by the British. And I think that that is so important, you know what I mean? And that it's just like avenues for you to use that, you know, to kind of set up a conversation, you know, with your students to really think about the historical, to really think about the political, you know, conversation around language. So that's what really stood out to me about that video. And shout out to Jamila, because I just absolutely love her work and love what she did there for us.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and I will just add in, love Jamila. She is a wonderful scholar, thinker, human being. And so she provides us with yet another lens by which to think about Blackness. Yes. And that's what Dr. April Baker Bell writes about as well, thinking about languages in the plural and understanding that languages are connected to larger histories and also larger cultural and linguistic practices that we have to attend to if we're going to truly understand the depth and the beauty of Blackness. And I just think she does it wonderfully.
Mm-hmm. So why don't we get started with our first question for both of you. What is your favorite piece of literature or language-based art? It could be a book, it could be a poem, a song, some form of multimedia that you enjoy and why? And we can start with you, Dr. Baker Bell.
Yeah, you know, I mean, I love all things Blackness. I love all things Black language. I'm not, you know what I mean? This was hard when I looked at that question to try to decide. I mean, I love music. I mean, and I listen to all music, old school rap music, trap music, whatever. I love it all. And I love the beauty of Blackness and Black language that's represented. I love poetry. Jamila is an example of that. But like, I think that there are examples of even, you know, poets that even come, you know, from a long time ago, like Amiri Baraka, like the beauty of poets like that, you know, like, and that's talking about the political freedom of Black people that always attracts me to it. But lately, you know, I've been really looking at one of my students, graduate students, Michael Wilson, who thinks about art. You know, he took one of my courses on Black language, and Kehinde Wiley's work is just so beautiful. And my student was making a connection between Black language and Black art and how you need Black language in order to interpret that art. You know what I mean? He was looking at, there was this sculpture I think Kehinde did with this person that had what we call 360 waves. And he's like, how could you talk about the waves if you don't have Black language to talk about the 360, the waves that are spinning? And that just really blew, my mind, that like the necessity of the language to even talk about art, to even talk about our theories of reality, and so that Kehinde Wiley's artwork is just so important to me. And I also love memes. I love Black Twitter, I love memes. I think that is so important, especially to the youth now. It's almost like this visual representation of Black language, that's not alphabetic, but you can look at a Black meme and see that Blackness and see and interpret, what's going on in there in and through Black language. So I'm just a fan of it all. I'm just anything, Blackness and Black language, that's my favorite.
Okay. And you, Dr. Kinloch?
I mean, dang, April Baker Bell. That's it. I mean, you answered the question for me. I love everything that's Black. I love everything guided by, grounded in, framed in Blackness. I don't think I've ever had a favorite because it's all just favorites.
Mm-hmm.
I like poetry. I like music. I like social media when it's not being anti-Black. Be honest about that. I will say one of the things that you didn't mention, Dr. White, is that I am also the author of 2 books on poet educator June Jordan. And I like June Jordan. And so those were the first 2 books that came to me. And I love poet, educator, essayist, activist, humanitarian, June Millicent Jordan, because she provides us with a framework for understanding these times that we're in, whether it's her essays, her poetry, the plays, the everything that she did. And so when I thought about this question, the first person who came to me was poet, educator, activist June Jordan. And she has this just wonderful poetry. But one in particular is titled Poem for South African Woman. And I've been referencing it a lot lately. And I just want to read the ending to this poem because it's kind of long, but the very last part of this poem says, "And who will join this standing up? And the ones who stood without sweet company will sing and sing back into the mountains, and even if necessary, under the sea. We are the ones we've been waiting for." And for me, Black folks have always been the one, and we continue to be. And so how do we engage in this work through Blackness because of Blackness in ways where we're talking about language, literacy, culture, we're talking about our favorites being Black. And for me, it's Black.
Yeah. Could I add to Dean Kinloch? I want to add something because I also grew a love for June Jordan, and especially through you, Valerie, just like when we were in CNV, you would start us off with that poem, sitting under the tree. And I just absolutely love that. But recently I came across, and I never read, surprisingly, I never read this chapter called White English, Black English, The Politics of Translation by June Jordan. This book came to me before I received my own, like 2 days before I received my own book. And I just felt like the spirit of June Jordan is here and like blessing me and allowing for me to walk in there. But like, it's the last line or 2 lines of this chapter says, "I deeply hope that more of us will want to learn and protect Black language. If we lose our fluency in our language, we may irreversibly forsake elements of the spirit that have provided for our survival." And that is always what leads me in the work. When I think about the fight for Black language and Black liberation, I go back to that. That's always the reminder. And that's what I'm here to do. And anything that goes against that, that's not my ministry and that's not my work. So I just wanted to share that line.
But I just have to drop in there. You referenced CNV, Cultivating New Voices Among Scholars of Color, which is a mentoring program through the National Council of Teachers of English. And you also referenced the poem that I started some of the sessions with. And that poem goes something like, "Come on, come out wherever you are. We need to have this meeting under this tree that ain't even been planted yet." And that's by June Jordan. And it's a simple, only a few lines, really gets to the point. And for me, that poem really summarizes what I believe I know of you and your commitment to Black language, literacies, and culture. It is about having a meeting under a tree, even if that tree hasn't been planted yet, but we've got to plant it, we've got to cultivate it, and we've got to do the work in order to understand Black language is Black liberation. And I think that's what we're talking about here today. So thank you for taking me back to that point.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Mhm. So I'll add a little. I have been a fan of Ishmael Reed's writing for a long time. And I think the first book I read by him was the book called Mumbo Jumbo. And I think Mumbo Jumbo really fits in with this conversation we're having, because I did a search for the etymology of the word. And what I found was corruption of the words mama di yumbo. And so here we see mumbo jumbo is actually the corruption of a Mandingo phrase, and it has attached to it a pejorative nature, a pejorative understanding. And we can see from that how colonialism not only destroys people, but it also corrupts people's language. So Dr. Baker Bell, could you help us understand some of the terms that are used when we talk about Black English? Because there are a lot of them out there. We, meaning the Pride team, typically uses AAVE or African American Vernacular English, but could you help the audience know a little bit more about some of the other ways it's described?
Yeah, you know, I typically in my work, I use Black language, and I use Black language following in line with Dr. Geneva Smitherman was my mentor and advisor on my dissertation committee. And she tended to, you know, go with Afrocentric, you know, perspectives that, you know, that thought about Black language not only as a dialect of the English language, but also thinking about the West African features that influence the language, you know. And so she, you know, so there's this thing, was it a dialect or a language? And like Dr. G always reminds me, whether it's a dialect or a language, we know it's the way Black people talk, you know. So I don't have a dog in a fight in terms of what term we use. So typically, you know, you hear African American Vernacular English, African American language, African American English, Black English, you know, Black language, you hear Ebonics, and all of those are typically used interchangeably, you know, to describe, you know, the way that Black people talk, or Black talk, you know, or spoken soul, you know, those are some other terms. And so like, you know, right now in the literature, you do tend to see people are using Black language and African American language, but also, you know, people are using African American Vernacular English. And so in my class, when I'm teaching, you know, students and pre-service teachers about it, I bring this conversation up so that there's no confusion, but we're talking about the same thing here.
Mm-hmm. And could both of you tell us a little bit about how you became interested in learning more and writing more about Black English and linguistics?
I'm going to let you go, Dean Sherlock, and I'll follow.
As I'm giving you a look like, you want to go first? So Dr. White, the question is, how did we become involved, interested?
What made you interested in it?
So I go all the way back to South Carolina, where I was born and raised. You know, the segregated South in working class environment. And the language that has always been spoken, or the languages that have always been spoken in that community, whether we were sitting on the porch, whether we were inside the house at the kitchen table, whether we were outside playing with neighbors. And then when we went into schools, elementary, middle, high school, and being surrounded by Black language and speaking it, listening to it, loving it, embracing it, and not having it questioned as something other than what it is, which is Black language that represents Black people across different kinds of spaces and places. Mm-hmm. And leaving the familiarity of that space and entering into other spaces and hearing how people would talk about Black people and how people would describe Black language as not a language. Mm-hmm. That was troubling and problematic, to say the least. And so if I think about my first interaction with, I'm interested in, it's always been there. It's always been there since the time that I could walk and talk and listen and tell stories and hear stories being told to me. It has always been there with the Black teachers who have educated me and prepared me for the world in which I live, whether it was my elementary school teachers, Miss Kirkland, Miss Ferguson, my middle school teachers, Miss Smalls, Miss Green, Miss Washington. I can go on, but I've always had Black woman teachers and others. And I've always been in environments where Blackness has been affirmed and embraced and loved. And it's not until traveling outside of those spaces and places where you realize that it's not the same thing for other people. So it's always been there.
Okay.
I love that. I mean, I just really love that. Was affirming. It just spoke to my soul, you know. And I think similarly, you know, it's, you know, being on this journey and doing, you know, this work has also like, you know, taken me back to a space, you know, like from the time I was born, like just thinking about my mother tongue. And I grew up in Detroit. And so like Detroit for me has always been a Black space, and Black language and Black culture and Black things were always central to my upbringing. You know what I mean? I didn't feel, you know, like my language being disrespected. It was the language. It's what we use, what we communicated. You know, it was what was used in the home. My parents never told me that I needed to do anything else other than be myself in order to do in this world, in order to be in this world. So I think having that love of Blackness and having that love of my language has always been with me. And then when you move, like, you know, Dean Kinloch just said, out of those contexts, and you feel that anti-Blackness, you feel that violence against Blackness, that violence against Black language, is like, you know, so, but I always talk about the story of, I feel like my students, when I was a high school teacher in Detroit, it was my students, you know, that really pushed me to enter into what Dr. G calls the language wars. Like my students questioned the notion of of standard English, you know, and I knew that they were right. Like when I was talking to them about, you know, okay, standard English, you know, it's kind of this universal thing. We all use it, because I was ill prepared to go in the classroom to teach around language. Though I had this cultural experience, I didn't have the preparation to go in there and to affirm it. Not that I was like violent to my students, but I didn't know how to engage the conversation when they said, what do I look like talking like that? It don't even sound right. Well, I got to talk white in order for me to be, you know, who I am. And so those were the kind of questions the students, you know, wanted to talk about beyond the technical differences. And I wasn't prepared for that. So I knew that there was an issue, because those students were speaking the truth, you know? And so like on a cultural level, yes, I could engage, but why aren't teachers prepared to acknowledge and to honor and to work with Black students in their language? So that's kind of how I began and to study and began to get into the work. And then I looked at the work of Dr. G, who's a native Detroiter, pioneer in Black language. Ann Arbor Black English case happened right, you know, 45 minutes from where I grew up. And I'm like, why didn't I understand this or know this, you know, going through my teacher education program. So that was the beginning of my entry into this work, you know, and that's where I stand on. And so like, I'm trying to speak back to that 22-year-old me who was not prepared, you know, to go in the classroom and to honor, you know, Blackness and to affirm it in different ways, to, not to just perpetuate kind of this, you know, anti-Blackness that we see happening in classrooms. So, you know, it's like I say, it's part of it, you know, it's deep, you know, it's always been there, but I think it was my students that really pushed me into that fight. And then like coming into the work and meeting people like Dr. G, like Valerie Kinloch, like Marcel Haddix, like Carmen Kennard, you know, and also the other Black language scholars, you know, David Kirkland, Django Perez, you know, John Ball, and all of these Black language scholars, Arnita Ball, who were doing the work, you know, just really made a way and built a path that I could enter into and just, you know, kind of push the work forward. So that's, you know, that's my entry and my story.
Mm-hmm. And so my entry was a lot more limited than you all's. Obviously, you have a lot more depth than I do. But I'm pretty sure that it started with being a little unsettled when I kept hearing about the so-called 30 million word gap. I don't know if people are familiar with the 30 million word gap. It's a sort of way of thinking that came from research by Betty Hart and Todd Risley in 1995. And they did a study of a small group of people, just 42 people, and their conclusions have had ramifications across the early education world, where lots of people think that part of the reason that Black children aren't able to learn is because their parents don't talk to them enough. And so what they concluded was that by the time poor children, and poor is often translated into Black, poor children are 3 years old, they hear 30 million fewer words. And because of that, that's the reason that they can't do well in language arts, reading, writing, that sort of thing. And so, I mean, I kind of accepted that information at first, and then it started to bug me more and more. And then I just did a quick search online for debunking Hart and Risley. and all of this information appeared of other scholars who've challenged their research, legitimately challenged their research, challenged the way they chose subjects for the research, how they collected the data, their cultural biases, and the fact that they don't even use a linguistic theoretical framework to come up with their conclusions. And so that's what led me to start reading about it and wanting to share some of that information with some of the other folks at the Office of Child Development.
So can I just drop something in there based on what both of you talked about here?
Mm-hmm.
And this is what I'm thinking right now. So when you just offered that as an example, and then connect that to what Dr. April said in reference to having students who were speaking the truth and doing the truth. And yet, for whatever reasons, many of which we know, then we get to this point where speaking their truths and thinking about that study about what people think Black kids don't have and what they think Black kids should have. You know, I started with June Jordan, and I'm telling you, she has the answer to so many things. She has this poem where she says, "Wrong is not my name is not wrong. You know, I am not wrong. As a Black woman, as a Black person, as a person in the body that I am in." And when we get to the point where we understand Black languages connected to Black histories and Black cultures and Black ways of being and Black intellectual traditions, and then we say, how do we connect that to all the people that Dr. April Baker Bell mentioned, from Geneva Smitherman to John Ball, to Marcel Haddix, to Carmen Kennard, to Elaine Richardson, to Rickford, to all of these folks who've done the work. We've got to push back, and we've got to really ask and answer that question. So how is it that people still see Black children, Black youth, and Black adults as wrong? Like, what is so pervasive in this larger culture that people continue to see Blackness as other than what we are, which is brilliant and beautiful and full of complexities and nuances? And I always just sit back and I wonder, like, and I don't wonder because I think we know the answer to why people see it as wrong. So I don't wonder about it, we know. And yet we have to think about the work that continues to have to happen. You know, I think about all of the women who I worked with and who invited me into their dissertation studies as their chair. I think about people like Carlotta Penn or Tanya Burkhardt or Danya Bridges Thomas, or just like they always asked questions about identities as connected to Blackness in every work and every writing and everything that they did. And they understand that Blackness is connected to these longer histories. And my question becomes, why are we not having those conversations in our classrooms, in our teacher education programs? We've got to do a better job. And I think that we know the answers. We've got to figure out a way to ensure that those answers and realities become a part of what we do with other people.
Thank you. She's just blown us away, right, April?
Mm-hmm.
So that leads me to my next question, which is, how would you both define anti-Black linguistic racism? I think you've touched on it a bit already, but give us a little bit more.
Go for it, Dr. April.
So I'm going to talk about, I'll talk about anti-Black linguistic racism, especially because it's really a term that I coined. I will talk about what led me there. Working with youth, all of the things that Dean Kinloch just pointed out for us is that, Black youth, when we're listening to them, when Black children and Black people, Black families, when we're listening to them, we learn so much. And so it was through, my research and teaching with youth in Detroit that I came to begin thinking about. I think we've always thought about anti-Black linguistic racism, but in terms of like just a term, working with the Black youth, they were trying to understand how they were experiencing racism in and through their language, but they didn't have the language to describe what they were experiencing, right? Like there's linguistic racism. And sometimes when we're talking about linguistic racism, Black people get left out of that conversation, right? We're not deemed as even having a language in the first place to even experience linguistic racism, right? And so like anti-Black linguistic racism came up when I was thinking about Dumas and Ross, I think in 2016 came out with Black crit, and they were thinking about anti-Blackness in education. And that really informed my thinking, like, it's anti-Black linguistic racism. It's thinking about anti-Blackness and linguistic racism coming together. And the reason it's important to say anti-Black linguistic racism, because in larger critical race kind of theories, you know, language is left out of that. You know, we were arguing till we are like blue in the face about, you know, anti-Blackness, but when language comes into the play, we're like, no, you know what I mean? You need the master's tools to dismantle the master's house. But Audre Lorde always said, no, the master tools will never dismantle the master's house. And so that's anti-Black linguistic racism. I'm going to read something just really briefly in terms of how I define it. So anti-Black linguistic racism refers to the linguistic violence, persecution, dehumanization, and marginalization that Black language speakers endure when using their language in schools and in everyday life. And that really comes from the Black youth. I was always interested in, how are you experiencing your language in schools? And it always came back where it was persecution, dehumanization, marginalization. And the examples I have here, it includes teachers silencing, correcting, and policing students when they communicate in Black language. It's the belief that there's something inherently wrong with the way Black people communicate. It is, it includes, I think I just said, it's the belief that there is something inherently wrong, therefore it should be eradicated. It is denying Black students the right to use their native language as a linguistic resource during their language and literacy learning. It is requiring that Black students reject their language and culture to acquire what I'm saying is white mainstream English. And it also insists that Black students code switch to avoid discrimination. You know, some people, you know, will argue that, well, you know, code switching, you know, does not perpetuate anti-Black linguistic racism, but because it validates and affirms and respects Black language in a process of teaching Black students academic language. But I contend that any approach that does not interrogate why students of color are required to code switch and only acknowledges their native tongue as a bridge to learn white mainstream English perpetuates anti-Black linguistic racism. And so that's how I'm thinking about it. And I think that there are several examples of it. You know what I mean? If we think about the fact that Black people were denied access to literacy by law, anti-Black linguistic racism. You know what I mean? The fact that, you know, enslaved Africans, you know, language planning were used so that they would not end up in the same group, so that they could communicate to each other is an example of anti-Black linguistic racism from the very start. And I think if we continue to kind of follow that history and look at what we're seeing today, it's always been there. And we have to be able to name it. If we're talking about Black language and Black liberation, we have to be able to name it and call that out so that we can move forward.
Thank you. I see your face, Dr. Kinloch, but I'm still going to ask, do you have anything to add to that?
What? April Baker Bell just laid it down. I have a lot that I could add to it, and I'll add just a couple of things. You know, when Dr. April was talking there, I was thinking about the work of Elaine Richardson, for example. And, you know, Elaine Richardson offers us an important understanding of Black language and Black languages. And especially in one of her books where she talks about when we teach Black kids to hate their languages, when we teach them to hate, for example, African-American English or African-American language or Black English, we're teaching them to hate themselves. And we need to figure out how to interrupt and disrupt that way of teaching. And so exactly the question in terms of, you know, what is anti-Black linguistic racism? I believe that Dr. April has explained it well, and it connects to that idea of what are we teaching our kids and how are we teaching our kids? And if we are teaching pedagogies of hate and hatred, then we are essentially saying, if you hate your language, then I'm also teaching you how to hate yourself and your Blackness. And we got to refigure all of that. And by refiguring it, we've got to figure out a way to not just disrupt it, but to reject and resist that hatred as we teach about Black language and Black love. And I will say that, you know, it's in one of the chapters that Dr. April writes this, and I just want to offer you your words back to you, Dr. April, because they're powerful. And in this chapter, you write, and I quote, "My hope with anti-Black linguistic racism is that it will move us beyond general theories of linguistic racism and offer a Black theorization of linguistic racism that is necessary to examine how Black people, specifically Black students, experience linguistic oppression in an anti-Black white supremacist education system and society. And that is the power of this framework. That is the power of anti-Black linguistic racism, and being able to talk about it, to name it, and then to seriously critique it as we help people understand that we can't hate ourselves. And if we can't hate our languages, and we can't hate our cultures. And I think that's the work that you do so just brilliantly in this book. So I offer that, we can't hate Black people and Blackness. And when we start these pedagogies of hate and hatred, that's essentially what we're teaching. And we've got to interrupt and disrupt that completely.
Absolutely.
Thank you both for that. So you sort of answered the next question, but before I even touch on it a second, Dr. Baker-Bell, could you help people know what code switching is in case folks in the virtual audience don't know what that is?
Well, in schools, how it's taught, there's, several definitions, but what I typically see in schools in terms of how teachers teach students to code switch is they help them to think about the formality of a situation. They want them to think about the audience and the purpose of when you're using your language. But typically the audience and the purpose is always honors white linguistic cultural norms and values. There's not a way for students to think about language in that context. And then even thinking about the formality of the situation, like you want to, use this, you want to be able to code switch, for opportunity or success, or you want to think about the situation that you're in. First of all, there are a few things like you cannot reduce an entire language to an informal language, right? There are formalities, informal and formal formalities, even within the Black language system. So that is like, that is a way to teach. Even like if this theory, like Rebecca Wheeler and Rachel Swartz's book on code switching, it even teaches students to think about church. In church, which language would you use? And so in this teaching, it's like, well, you wouldn't use Black language in a church. Black kids and Black people, like, what church don't you use Black language in? Or like, you don't use Black language at a wedding. What wedding you going to? And it's like, it creates this kind of division and like this kind of confusion because it's a misunderstanding of Black culture, and it's very problematic. But even when we talk about code switching as a survival tool, the students I worked with in Detroit questioned that, right? When I was working with some of the students, it was in the midst of Trayvon Martin being murdered by George Zimmerman. And the kids were like, if code switching can save our life, why didn't it save Trayvon Martin's life when he said, "Why are you following me?" And that is just as clear as you could understand it. We would consider that standard English syntax. Like, what are we talking about? So like, I even question code switching, like in terms of us teaching that when we are watching Black people being killed on the streets, when they are saying things like, "I cannot breathe," or in some cases before they even open their mouth. Like we have to be able to interrogate this in a larger system. How can something be a technique for survival if it can't save my life? Right. And that is the point of thinking about bringing together, thinking about anti-Black linguistic racism. It's a real conversation that has to happen when we're talking about code switching. But typically that's how teachers deal with code switching in the classroom, is for survival, or, switch your language. And to be honest, most teachers can't even recognize what Black language is in the first place. They might recognize certain features like habitual B, but they ignore the entire rhetorical, function of the language. They don't know, all of the different features. So really nothing is happening outside of telling kids, you can't talk Black, if you want to make it in this world. And that is insufficient. That's not enough, and also you can't say that when we are saying the capitalization and commodification of Black language by non-native Black language speakers. How do you tell Black children they cannot have success when you go into these stores, which in my book, I show like all of these pictures that I have, and Black language is being capitalized on by non-Black language speakers. You cannot say that. Like, we're watching these commercials and we see Black language. We're seeing the use of rap music. You cannot continue to tell Black kids that they can't make it. We're seeing white Instagram celebrities capitalizing off of Black language and culture, but we're telling Black kids in schools, you can't even use your language as a resource for learning. It's problematic, and I think we have to rethink it. So I can't even begin to talk about code switching if you're not willing to interrogate this larger system, that we're working in. It's irresponsible to tell Black kids that they need to code switch if you're not talking about anti-Black linguistic racism, the capitalization and commodification of Black language. You can't talk about that. You have to deal with these real life things that are impacting us every single day as Black people.
I know you're not going to let me off the hook with this one, Dr. White. So let me just jump on in because Dr. April Baker Bell just ended with what I exactly was going to say in terms of, do we really think that Black people are the only people who code switch?
Yeah.
And what are the codes that we're switching from into others? Because all of this language and languages, all of this stuff, all of this are codes. And so what are we switching from into what? And I just think that we have to be clear about exactly what Dr. April just talked about. We are teaching Black kids from an early age that in order to be successful in this world, in this capitalist patriarchy, we have to code switch, and we have to actually put aside not just our languages, but our ways of being, our ways of thinking, our ways of talking, interacting, walking down the street, dressing, our hair, our everything. We've got to put all of those codes aside to accept a different set of codes that might still not save our lives. So it's kind of like, we got to complicate that. So let me offer this, because I truly believe that this is a beautiful book. And I'm going to refer to it every time I get every opportunity. You've got the answers in this book. And if all of you have not read this book by Dr. April Baker Bell, I'm asking you to get it, read it again, teach it, because the answer to the question is right here where you write yourself, Dr. April, and I quote, "Some believe that Black students must code switch to be successful in school and in life." And then you argue that while you're not denying that some Black language speakers have not experienced temporary success by way of code switching, you say that you're questioning what gets lost or sacrificed in the process. What is really being achieved when we are telling Black people to code switch? Then you go on to say, who is privileged with making these decisions about who gets to and who doesn't get to enter into spaces because they're code switching? But the piece here that I want to make sure everyone hears, and these are your words. You write, "I have also heard teachers promise Black children that code switching will help them get into college and earn a college degree." Okay, what you say. So give up your culture and your language in favor of achieving at best a house, a car, a whole lot of college debt. Why would Black people want to give up parts of their identity and culture for this Dow level of success? And, you know, when I first read that before the book came out, and when you were conceptualizing this entire project, and I read that, and I had a moment where it took me back to 2010, when I was thinking with Philip and Khalik in New York City's Harlem community. And Philip, I believe, a young Black boy who was in high school at the time, stared at me and said, "I am not going to be a traitor to Black English." Like, what am I going to trade? I'm going to be a traitor to Black English for what? And we had a moment. And, you know, you have this high school age kid who, you know, is talking about not wanting to be a traitor to Black English. And I had to take a moment to think, like, what is it that we need to learn from Philip and from Khalik? What is it that we need to learn from other Black kids and young adults about what we're asking from Black folks when they enter into these institutionalized spaces like schools? And what are we asking or forcing them to leave behind? And how do we complicate that by saying we cannot ask Black kids to take off their language, their culture, their identities as they walk across a threshold into a school that is supposed to love and care for them, but is telling them to code switch and to become other than who they are? That is just not right. That's not good. And so what we have to do is many things, but one thing is to, how do we upend these systems and practices that continue to relegate Blackness to the bottom all the time? But when do we get to the point where we understand Blackness as connected to a history of struggle, strife, and love and success? And then we frame our classroom teachings based on that understanding of Blackness. Until we do that, we will always have conversations about why Black kids should code switch, or the benefits of code switching into a different language as opposed to the one that you have and using it to demonstrate who you are. I just think that we've got to complicate this, and we've got to understand the brilliance, as I've already said, of Blackness and how to cultivate it, Can you imagine a Philip and a Khalik, for example, and the work that they have done in this world and that they can continue to do as embodying Blackness? Like, that's the work. And we've got a long way to go in order to do all of what April has talked about.
So believe it or not, we only have about 8 more minutes for the Pride questions, and then we're going to go into our audience Q&A. And so I've been trying to figure out which of these questions that remain I have to choose from. But I did want to hear from either of you maybe a little more specifics about what happens to children, young children, middle school children, high school children, when they are in the school setting and their language is being squashed. So just to help people understand some of the particulars about what's happening to them, because I think people need to hear it and need to know it because it's very harmful.
Yeah, and I think it's like in the work in that article that Dr. Kinloch just talked about of not being a traitor to Black English was really just something that spoke to my soul, because while those were students in New York, the same thing the students in Detroit were telling me. It really, like, they begin to internalize this anti-Black racism that we're talking about, and that has really damaging effects on their identity development, but also just on their humanity. It is very damaging. And so, like, my work always, I frame it as asking students, how are you experiencing it? And the students will say, like, first of all, sometimes I don't know what I'm doing wrong, you know what I mean? Or students would say, oh, our people aren't dumb. I didn't know that we had a history to our language. Or they would say, one of the young ladies I talk about in the book, Janelle, she talks about how she felt her teachers are trying to scrutinize her from a very young age, because they would constantly correct her, constantly police her, and couldn't even tell her what she was doing wrong in the first place. And so the students, me thinking about the forwarding of this anti-racist Black language pedagogy has to put all of this technical stuff people talking about to the side. We have to deal with the internalization of anti-Black racism. That is far more impactful and causing harm to our kids than anything. You can't tell kids, that, they're going to code switch as if that's going to cause some type of healing, or as if code switching is going to get them into the college door and they're not going to experience more anti-Blackness. That is not a paradise. You know what I mean? Academia does not exist and schools does not exist outside of the world. So I talk about this pedagogy is soul work. It's spiritual work, you know what I mean? That connects their history, their culture, the understanding racism and understanding all of these things together is so important for their soul. Because if they understand anti-Black racism, they understand this is not about me. This is about racism. This is not my problem. It's nothing with my language. It's nothing with who I am. And that is more important to me than anything else. It has to happen, because listening to the Black youth talk to me about their experiences and listening to the type of damage that's happening in classrooms, how it's linguistic and cultural battlegrounds, it's just like, it's disheartening, and while, I learned that Black youth, they do have ways of resisting. They're resilient and they know how to resist anti-Blackness and protect their language, but there are still examples where they're internalizing this. And so we just have to do better, by, Black children, by Black language, by Black people. And so those are the kinds of examples I've seen in my own research and teaching.
And Dean Kinloch, anything to add?
I think I would say, one of the things that I've been very focused on for a number of years, and I know that Dr. April has also been focused on, is this larger understanding of students' rights and students' rights to their own language. And so the 4Cs, the Conference on College Composition and Communication, and with a lot of great leadership by a lot of Black language and literacy scholars, including Dr. Geneva Smitherman, in 1972, this organization approved this resolution that all students have a right to their own languages and identities. And I start there, not as a way to say that's where this work begins, but to say that that is a moment that has allowed us to then connect these larger, longer histories to the struggle for Black languages and Black identities and Black literacies. And then we get to the 70s. And then what happens after that resolution is passed? We still have these mountains to climb, and we still do today. We can talk about the Ann Arbor Black English case, We can talk about all of the things that have happened and continue to happen with, do all children in Detroit, for example, have a right to literacy? That's also, do all Black children have a right to languages and literacies across the United States and across the globe? But if we focus on these particular socio-political contexts, for me, the questions always come back to, why do our Black kids and young adults don't have a right to their own languages? Why is it that we are separating this whole, you speak this way in school, but in your home or familial community, then you can speak that way? Like, we do this division as a way to think about, not critically, what people think language is, as opposed to understanding the multifaceted ways that people, Black folks in particular, communicate. And so, for me, it's taking questions up about who's right to what language and why not. It's asking questions about the disconnections between the language that our people use in their homes and the language that they are told to use when they enter into certain types of academic institutions. It's also a question of, like, how do we understand the connections between language and power?
Yes.
And we've got to talk about power. And if we're not talking about power, then we're reproducing and reiterating these narratives about whiteness, monolingual and monocultural norms that get reproduced and reiterated without a critical understanding of the connection between languages and power, identities and power. And what Dr. April Baker Bell talks about, anti-Black racism and anti-Black linguistic racism, and its groundedness in power and power constructs. And we will continue to have anti-Black racism if we are not examining and thinking deeply about institutions and systems and policies and practices that need to change and that need to understand Blackness, among other things. So those are some of the questions that I continue to think about. And I think about that even in the work that I currently do.
Yeah. And one of the questions that I continue to think about is, how is it that we can better reach parents, particularly parents of young children, before they enter kindergarten, so that these parents have the knowledge that this is something that their children will likely experience in the classroom, and figure out ways for those parents to become advocates for their children so that they can protect their children from these things that happen as early as kindergarten. And so that's some of the work of the Pride program, trying to figure out how we get this information to parents to better educate them and arm them and make them advocates of their children.
Yeah, that's really, I mean, and as a Black parent myself, of a 7 and 14-year-old, it's I think about it, you know what I mean? And I think like it's important, I even think, for me to write about that and to a parent audience one day, because it's things that I think about every day, you know what I mean? It's what I teach my kids every day. Like, people ask me, what do I do at home? Do I use Black language? I mean, like, is that really a question? You know what I mean? It's so important, for my kids to understand Black language, for their survival. Right. For their survival. That's how for their survival, period. And I think, it's important. And in my book, I try to write it in a way that's also inviting to parents. I talk about my parents, in my book. It's not just like an academic text. I wrote it for Black people. And so, like, there are people in my community reading the book, and I'm so grateful for that. I tried to break it down in a way that my mother could read it and understand what's happening, and which she did, because she influenced a lot of what went into it. And I think it is important for us as even writers and educators and scholars to begin thinking about parents and larger communities outside of academic context when we are trying to get this message out, and so I think that that's really important. And I think it's important for parents to be able to rely on Dr. White, Dr. Kinloch, and myself. We should be available, to, which that's your work, you know what I mean? But honestly, to answer those kinds of questions, that they're thinking about in their home, and preparing them before their kids even get into schools, in the first place. I actually think that's where the work needs to happen more, in community spaces among parents, because if we have that knowledge and we have that understanding, we can, we don't have to wait on school systems to change, right? You know what I mean? We go in there with the knowledge and challenge school systems and make them change, to take care of our Black kids. If you say that, like, you care about the education of everyone, then this is what you need to do for Black children and youth.
Oh yeah, and I just want to add into that exactly what you just said. One of my a friend who lives in South Carolina, she's a critical educator, just a critical educator, Janice Baines. She reminds me every day. She works with primarily elementary age kids in public schools in Columbia, South Carolina, and it's Janice Baines who reminds me that even the youngest of us, we already have the capacity to think and to do and to be. We already, we know who we are, from the youngest of us to the oldest of us. And so how is it that we deny people access to understanding what we already know, which is Black language, Black history, Black communities, Black families, connected to understanding a humanizing critical approach to taking the work up in every environment, at every moment, and not selectively. And so, there are people like Janice Baines, there are people like Marcel Haddix, there are other folks who, the commitment to this work is just the truth. And if we can somehow take those commitments and really understand our connections to communities and families, then I think that we can do this even deeper. And that's what they offer me, a framework for doing this work in classrooms with our young kids, in communities with, our middle schoolers, our high schoolers, our college students, but also just in communities, outside of an academic environment, in the streets with other people who are thinking about Black language as Black liberation. And that's just powerful for me. So I see the examples, I read about the examples, I witness the examples, and I'm motivated to continue doing the work because we have so many people who are doing this work with our kids and who are not apologizing for doing the work in critical ways with our kids.
Thank you both. I'm going to hand it over to Medina to share with us some of the audience questions. Medina, are you there? There you are.
Hey everyone, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. So thanks again to all the panelists for joining us this evening, as well as to everyone in attendance in the audience and everyone watching on YouTube. There were a lot of questions, so I'm just gonna jump right in. I'm thinking we can get to maybe 2 or 3 questions in the time that we have left for the webinar. So the first question, and this can be for all 3 of you, and I've had to kind of collapse some questions into one, did my best to do that. How can educators, including white educators, who are pre-K to 12th grade, effectively validate and celebrate AAVE or Black language in the classroom without appropriating the culture and making sure they're still prepared for a successful K to 12 experience? So what specific strategies, especially within a literacy context, can educators use? And I would expand that to classroom educators as well as educators in community space as well. Aisha, you want to start?
Maybe
Thinking of early childhood?
I'll let Dr. Baker Bell start.
Yeah, I just maybe want to get to the thing of appropriation, because that's one of the things that stood out to me. I think you don't have to appropriate the culture and the language. I think it's going back to what Dean Kinloch said. Many Black language speakers, students, no matter from the youngest to the oldest of us, know about our language and know about our culture. I think what you're doing is providing a space for it to happen, right? And not policing it. Like, you don't have to speak Black language because Black kids already know Black language, right? You know what I mean? You don't have to appropriate the culture because Black kids already know about the culture. I think your job is to facilitate learning where those things can happen, where it's not happening in a way in which they are experiencing anti-Black linguistic, racism or policing, or that where we're demanding that these students change and give up who they are in order to learn. So I think that those spaces can be cultivated. And in my book, I kind of described the anti-racist Black language pedagogy, and it's really broken up by teaching about the history, teaching about language politics, teaching about anti-Black linguistic racism, teaching about the culture, thinking about a language of solidarity across various linguistic communities of color. And I think that those things can occur, right? You know what I mean? Without appropriating. There is room in the movement for all of us have work to do, you know, and I think we have to understand that, like, provide a space for Black youth, you know, to be able to, you know, do what they need to do around their language. And you're just kind of facilitating learning is how I see it. Like when I'm teaching about various cultures and groups, I don't have to appropriate it to teach it, right? You know, so I think that that is just something important to keep in mind. And I talk about Black linguistic appropriation in the book, which is an important chapter to think about, because a lot of that is happening, you know, and I point out specifically what that is. And I think keeping that in mind would be something that's important.
Yeah, and I would add that I think that the biggest change that needs to happen, I think Dr. Baker Bell and Dr. Kenlock alluded to this, is that teachers really need to shift their thinking. They need to change their attitudes. And some of that is work that can come from learning, but some of it comes from the heart. And so you really have to believe that Black people are beautiful people, and then that will change the way you think. It'll change the way you teach. And, you know, in terms of practicality, there are some real obvious examples out there. You can find them on YouTube of educators who have taken that leap and changed the way they think and changed their hearts. And so they use Black English to help children learn language arts skills. And so a lot of it comes from changing who you are as a person, but there also are lots of examples of ways that you can actually do it in the classroom. If teachers are really dedicated to that, they can find that information.
And let me just add really quickly, I agree with everything that both of you have said. I also think that we oftentimes use phrases like culturally relevant pedagogies, culturally sustaining pedagogies, frequently and often without understanding what these things are. And so I would say that if we're talking about any educator, in this case, the question is about how white educators can celebrate African-American language in classrooms. So I think one of the first things to do is to understand language and understand what language means, understand what culturally relevant and culturally responsive pedagogies entail, understand how that pedagogical approach and framework connects to our uptake of culturally sustaining pedagogies and practices, and then go into the classroom and ask yourselves the question, who are you teaching? And you're not teaching text, you're teaching kids, you're teaching human beings. So who are you teaching? And how are you teaching our kids? What kinds of texts are you not using? Because I know the ones you're probably using, because I mean, they're the ones that become canonicized. What texts are you not using and why? Because when we think about representation and when we create, for example, book lists, or we create a curricula, and we don't have people of color, Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and other people of color in our curricula or on our reading list, then what are we teaching? And the excuse becomes, we don't have enough text by. We do. Yes. So I would ask everyone to think about how we are reshaping our curricular approaches to really be relevant, responsive, and sustaining, but understanding what those things mean, understanding what equity in education really means and what really equity in education entails. And then also saying representation, who gets represented in my curricula and who doesn't? And how do I actually redo all of that? And that's unlearning the things that we probably have already learned how to do for such a long time, but we got to unlearn it, because if we don't unlearn it, then that's an excuse for reproducing it. And so I just want to offer those as some suggestions. Look at what you are doing in your teaching, and then look at the kids, look into the faces and the eyes of the people who we are teaching, and understand you cannot do this work if you do not have a fundamental love and care for human beings, and especially Black kids. If you do not love us, you cannot teach us. And I'm gonna stop right there.
Yeah, snaps. I wish I had my bell.
This is what you get at 5:30 to 7. Like, this is all the realness. We want it. So I've got another question, and this one is related to parents and caregivers. So y'all touched on this a little bit. So the question is coming from an educator who is asking, how can they be supportive of parents and caregivers when they witness, this comes from a real experience, where they witnessed a Black grandmother correcting their child or grandchild using when they were speaking AAVE or utilizing Black English, right? So we've internalized this as parents and caregivers as well, right? So what message would you give to parents and caregivers who may be struggling with that? And how can educators support them?
Well, I have a short answer, so I'll go first. I think that what has to happen with all of us, meaning Black people, is that we have to begin to understand a little bit more what has happened to us. And full disclosure, I was that person correcting language before I started learning more about African American vernacular English, and particularly before I watched the film Talking Black in America. It just completely blew me away. So we should be assuming that this parent is coming, or grandparent is coming, from a place of the heart and protecting their child and from their knowledge level. And it's based on what they know. And it's probably based on what they've learned historically from previous generations. And I think that it'll be really hard for the teacher to interrupt that, because this grandparent is like, I know this is the best thing for my grandchild. There have to be ways for us, maybe not the educator can do it, but us in the community, to help Black people understand this better so that they can have those same kind of shifts in their thinking that I had in my thinking. And so I guess the answer for that teacher is that she should probably not try to do much about it. I don't know if Dr. Baker Bell or Dr. Kinlock agree, because it might cause friction, and the grandparent might be considering, who are you to tell me how to help my grandchild to, have a better life? I think that it's on us other Black people, to help each other understand this so that we begin to change.
Yeah, I mean, it just reminds me, I thank you, Dr. White. It reminds me of what Dr. G calls the cycle of miseducation. Like the cycle of miseducation is generational. And, usually parents are trying to, and grandparents trying to protect, their kids from what they experience, what I mean? The hardships they experience going through school, the silencing they experience in schools, or what they consider their lack of success, even sometimes in life, without this fuller understanding of what we're talking about now, like, anti-Black, linguistic racism, and how these kind of things influence. I do think it's difficult, but I also know that how damaging that is, how correction is very damaging to Black kids too. It's not helpful. If you're correcting kids and the teacher does not have even the facility to show the differences in the languages, it's not helping that child anyhow. But it's complicated, as Dr. White is pointing out, right? But that's why I love spaces like this, where we do have parents, that are here and listening in to understand, like, what we are saying as researchers, as experts, as educators who are Black. Black language is our lived experiences, and it is our work, in terms of what we know. Like what I'm saying about what Black youth and what Dr. Kinlock is saying, and Dr. White is saying about the experiences and how this is not helpful to Black children's identity development is grounded in our research, what we know Black children and youth are saying. And it's some of the youth in my own work informed me that these type of things happen in the home. And it's really, it's hard, right? But what I loved was from the pedagogy, the work that I was doing in the classroom, that some of the Black youth took the conversation back home to the kitchen table and were able to talk to their parents and challenge them. It's an article that, like, work I did with Dr. Davina Jackson and Django Paris, we wrote about this, like how, sometimes it's that the youth are bringing it back to kind of transform and have this conversation. But I think involving the community, involving parents, hosting events like this, where we can be in conversation with community is just so important. That way that teacher does not have to carry the burden alone, of being able to kind of interrupt in some kind of way, what's happening to protect, the child. So.
And you both have answered, especially, you've answered the question. And so I'm not going to even attempt to answer the question. I'll just offer, I think it's important for everyone to start from a place of love and care, and to not make assumptions about what people can and cannot do. And so if there's a parent or a family member who is saying something to a kid, I have to understand, at least from my perspective, I assume that we all want what's best for our kids and for our families and for each other. And so I start from a place of love and a place of curiosity. I'm curious. I want to know, so why did you just make that particular move? Or, what stories might you have to tell about wanting to protect and safeguard a family member, particularly a young Black kid, from entering into what kind of world? I want to ask those questions. I want to know what people are thinking, because I do believe that folks might already have the answers themselves, but we oftentimes don't invite people into conversation. And when we do, we oftentimes don't listen. And so I want to be a listener. I want to invoke that spirit of care and love, where we can have conversations even if we disagree, and we can walk away from the conversations, hopefully better, whole human beings. And I think it's the same thing when we think about a grandmother correcting or, quote, changing the language of a grandkid. I think it's that person might come from a certain set of experiences that we might not even know. And how do we begin to set aside that negative judgment to really understand what we think we see is probably embedded in a longer history that person is bringing into their relationship with someone else, that we've got to understand. Because I believe that we all want what's best for our kids, our families, ourselves, and each other. And I would say that I hope that person does too. And so it's my responsibility to listen and to learn with that person. And I think that's important in how we think about this work.
I'll share one more question before I turn it back to Aisha for door prizes and call to action and resources. So make sure you're sticking around for that. So this last question kind of focuses on college and university. So interrogating language superiority in colleges and universities, how is Black language policed in academia, including the admissions process, curricular stagnation, and professors who have to navigate the ivory tower?
Okay, can you just give all that to us again? Because that's deep.
Big, yeah.
I need to listen.
Say that again. Yes. So interrogating language superiority in colleges and universities. How is Black language policed in academia, including the admissions process, curricular stagnation, right? So the curriculum and teaching, and then professors having to navigate the ivory tower. So I'm sure y'all have some experience in that area.
I don't have anything for y'all. I just, you are not gonna get me to go there.
That means you have all the things.
All the things.
Oh, wait, for real, Dr. White and Dr. Baker Bell, you.
I mean, it's such a big question. I could think of so many things. I mean, the one thing that I would say, the power in the kind of work that we are doing right now, the power in Dr. Kinloch, the power in Dr. White, the power in me, the power in people like Geneva Smitherman is so important. I entered into Michigan State. That's where I am faculty, but that's also where I was a graduate student. And I was fortunate for the foundation that Dr. Smitherman laid, because I was able to use Black language as my language, requirement in graduate school. And so her pioneering work has left, it's left a mark on Michigan State for those of us who are coming into work to continue. So I'm fortunate to be in that space to do the work, the kind of transformative work that we're seeing. That's not to say that, students aren't experiencing anti-Black linguistic racism. That's not to say that students are not being judged at admissions. That's not saying any of those things, but I think it's, it's pushing forward with the work, continue to transform policy, continue to I do a lot of teach-ins at Michigan State, to continue to change our departments, to continue to change our college, to make sure that they understand, the power of Black language. You can't, you can miss me with your diversity and inclusion, or anti-racism statements if you cannot honor Black language. And so you hold people accountable. And I'm so big on holding, folks at Michigan State, just accountable to that. You have to be able to recognize a people's language. If you're saying that you're about diversity, you're saying you're about inclusion, you're saying that you're about anti-racism, well, this is what it looks like. So I think that is just so important. I think that having conversations like what I'm talking about, this anti-Black, anti-racist Black language pedagogy, is so important, for, I think professors and students, everyone, like in higher education, to be able to understand, these linguistic hierarchies, that are set up, you know what I mean, for them. Like if you don't have a sense of it, that is just damaging, but having a sense of it gives you power, you know what I'm saying, to transform and navigate that system in and of itself. So that's one thing I have. That was a very powerful and loaded question, which I very much so appreciate, but that was the first thing that came to mind for me.
So I want to build from what you just said, because thank you for that. I was sitting here thinking, wow, this question is huge. And you just gave me a very clear roadmap into thinking about this question, Dr. April. And so when you just said holding people and systems accountable, and you also said really thinking about the navigation of systems, or how to navigate these systems, that's part of the work. That's a huge part of the work. And so I will share what everyone knows, or what most people who know the Pitt School of Education know. How do we hold systems accountable? How do we do this work in engaged ways? We name it. If we say we are committed to equity and justice and innovation, then let's name it. We can't just say it. We've got to name it, and then we got to make it a part of how we operate and how we function. And part of naming it is, we got this new mission vision statement in the School of Education. And I'm not going to read it to you all. I'm just going to tell you some of the lines and sentences from it. Our mission vision statement talks about we ignite learning and we strive for well-being for all. It's about we disrupt and transform an equitable educational structures. We understand learning as intertwined with health, wellness, and human development. Like in this mission vision statement, we talk about how we teach and we research and we advocate, and we do all of these things with integrity and dignity, and we lead. And it's like when you can name it, and when you can say as a school, this is what we're going to do, then we got a structure in place. And that structure allows us to say, I think that was a comment based in a deficit perspective, and I can't let that slide. So let me call you into a conversation so we can talk about what just happened. When you got a mission vision statement that sets the stage for the work that we need to do, you are able to have some really hard conversations with people who you might not really want to have those conversations with. But if it's grounded in equity and justice, we don't have a choice. We have to. And how do we invite people in the same way that I would want to be invited in? I just think that's so important. So when we hold people and systems accountable, we're also holding ourselves accountable. And we are saying that individually, I will stand in the work of equity and justice, even when no one else stands with me. And collectively, if we want to stand together, understanding this is our core, then let's do that work. And that's all about Black language and literacy as well. That's the work we've got to commit to doing, and we can't just do it by ourselves. We've got to figure out a way to do it ourselves and connect it to a larger purpose. And when I read your book, April, when I think about the work that you are doing, Dr. White, with Pride, when I think about this work, we have examples. We've got frameworks. We've got a structure. We are doing this work, and we've got to figure out even more expansive ways to invite other people in. And that's the part that we have to push for.
Thank you both. So I'm going to raffle off our door prizes, and then I'll do that quickly. And we may have a couple more minutes for our closing question. I hope we do. So we already have winners because they've already been selected. The first who will receive Talking Black in America is Cliff Moon. So Cliff, what we'll do is we'll send you an email, we'll get your address, and we'll send you the book. Our second winner is Ashley Ingram. Ashley, you get one of my favorites, Flossie and the Fox, one of very few picture books written in African-American vernacular English. That is a pet peeve of mine that I want to make a point of right now, because there are very few. There are lots and lots of picture books, not a lot of picture books written in Black English. So putting a plug in for that. And da-da-da. Dr. April Baker Bell's book is going to Donna Goodwin. Donna, you'll be getting this fabulous book. And last but not least is Dr. Kinlock's book, Race, Justice, and Activism in Literacy Instruction, is going to Rachel Savitz. Rachel Savitz. So we have about 4, maybe 3 minutes left, and I have a closing question. And that has to do with what you see as the future of Black language and what can we do? Medina referenced a call to action. What would you all say is the call to action? What's the future? I'm concerned about the future. I don't know if you all are. And then what is our call to action?
I'll say one thing, and I'm going to talk about the call to action and how I'm responding to it. But I think, like, you know, in doing this work, I think we need more happening and not relying on school systems as the only way to fight for Black linguistic justice and liberation. And so I am so happy, and this is dropping very soon, that I am in collaboration with my sister scholar, Dr. Carmen Kennard, and we are coming out with, we will be launching the Black language syllabus, which will be an online open source, you know, place that honors Black language and fights for Black liberation, that people will have access to, you know, freely. And we will have a Black language magazine where we are like accepting, you know, people writing blogs in any kind of way, not honoring the non-alphabetic text. But we feel that this work has to happen above and beyond and move beyond school systems, which it is happening, like the work you're doing, Dr. White. But this is just going to be an open source, you know, for people to have access to. We see that there is, like, while we're here doing this Black linguistic justice work, there is a fight, you know, on the other side of this to, I mean, and we're talking about language, you know what I mean? A fight for Black people to be able to be liberated in and through their language, that people are fighting us tooth and nail, but we are not going to stop. We're going to keep moving forward, and we're going to provide the people who are on the right side of history, the right side of people, the right side of justice, you know, with the work that they can do to move it forward. So that is my call to action. We need to see more of that, and also my response to that call.
And I'm going to be brief, so I'll let you go, because we want to end with you, Dr. Kinlock. And my call to action is just to continue to do the Pride work. We're really excited that we got an internal grant to do a specific project that's modeled after our Parent Village program, where we are focusing specifically on African American vernacular English. Our goal is to explore it with a group of parents, have conversations about it, and ultimately give them some of those skills that I referenced earlier on so that they can become advocates for their children.
Wow, that's wonderful. So I'm sitting down trying to write all of this down based on what you're saying. And so I would say call to action would be to, you know, look into the Office of Child Development and the Pride program here in the School of Education at the University of Pittsburgh, because you all are doing wonderful work, Dr. White. I would say, Dr. Bell, can you drop the name again of what you and Dr. Kennard are starting?
Yeah, it's the Black language syllabus. Hashtag Black language syllabus. I'll put it in the Q&A, and of course I'm going to send it to you. You don't have to write it down. But
we have the Black language syllabus and all of the work that Carmen Kennard does and everything that she does, as well as you, Dr. April Baker Bell. I would also say, if we need to, let's return to, or let's continue to take up the work of Black feminist scholars and practitioners. Let's take up the work of Black activists. Let's actually center folks who've done this work a long time ago, like June Jordan, Amari Baraka, folks who've been writing about Black and liberation. Let's actually focus on Geneva Smitherman and continuing to learn all the lessons that she's offered us. And then finally, I would say maybe 4 quick things. The Pitt Ed Justice Collective in the School of Education, we're doing this work. The Center for Urban Education under the leadership of Dr. Elon Dancy, doing this work. National Council for Teachers of English has been doing this work more and focusing on equity and justice. And I'm excited to eventually announce the theme for NCTE 2021, since I'm going to be program chair. And then finally, I mean, I have to say, Bettina Love and the Abolitionist Teaching Network. And if we don't know what it is, I ask us to look it up because Dr. Bettina Love has always been doing this work, and she's talking about abolitionists and abolitions. And so how do we think about this work deeply and meaningfully? And then how do we use the resources from all of this to change the world for the better? And that's my goal.
Awesome. So a quick surprise, we're only 1 minute over. If you all will look behind me, you'll see a t-shirt hanging up that has Pride on the front of it. Dr. Kinlock, I don't know if we gave you one already. If we didn't, you're going to get another one because our surprise is that we're going to send a Pride t-shirt to Dr. April Baker Bell and to Dean Valerie Kinlock.
Thank
And
you.
I will wear it with pride too.
That's a linguist there.
Adam, you're going to put something up on the screen with resources, or are you with us, Adam? Yes, so there's the link to the resources that I referenced and information about the In My Skin podcast that will drop on September 8th. And the third episode in that series on bias is on language bias. Thank you, everybody, for all your time. This has been wonderful, and we'll see you maybe next time.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.